I believe that no fight in the history of One Piece has been discussed as heatedly by fans as the battle between Luffy and Katakuri during the climax of the Whole Cake Island arc. While on the surface it seemed to be similar to the usual pattern that Luffy's battle followed throughout the story, this one felt oddly but pleasantly different. And I think many people couldn't quite pinpoint what exactly it was that made Katakuri so unique as a major One Piece antagonist compared to the likes of Crocodile, Lucci, or Doflamingo. When we first meet Katakuri in the story, he's introduced as the typical trope of the cool, calm, and competent villain that seems to be on top of things no matter what. Compared to most of his siblings, he stands out as someone who's actually able to take action on his own, and we understand right from the get-go that this is someone who's essential in keeping the Big Mom Pirates relevant as a Yonko crew, functioning as the de facto captain during Big Mom's rage. Combined with his power, as well as the deep care he shows for his family, he's one of the most popular members of the crew in all of Whole Cake Island. On top of all this, Katakuri also introduces us to the concept of future sight, a very advanced form of Kinbunshoku Haki that allows him to look several seconds ahead into the future and react accordingly. A skill so rare that it's not even shared by his mother Big Mom. And so, overall, when Luffy manages to pull Katakuri into a 1 vs 1 fight in the mirror world to enable his crew's escape, naturally, we all anticipated this battle to be one of the most challenging ones for Luffy so far, against an antagonist that seems extremely rational and calculated. And what follows is one of the best battles and character arcs in the story so far. This is where the main theme of Katakuri's character comes into play, and it's actually so important that it will serve as the overarching framework for this entire character analysis. Mirrors. Everything about Katakuri is reflected in the symbol of the mirror. On the smallest level, this can be seen in terms of his future sight, that is all about looking ahead and seeing things that you usually can't, just like you can use a mirror to look around corners. And just like a mirror, your future sight can be blurred when losing composure. But I honestly think it's so much more interesting to look at this symbol on a much larger scale, because the main implication here is that Katakuri and Luffy mirror each other as characters on more than just one level. To really understand to what extent Oda has created Katakuri as a mirrored version of Luffy, I think it's best to peel away the layers one by one. On the most superficial level, Luffy and Katakuri are similar simply based on their devil fruit powers. While Luffy is made of rubber, Katakuri is made of mochi, a malleable sort of rice cake that can easily change its shape. This is not the first time that Oda has shown us a villain with a similar power to Luffy's. Thinking back to before the time skip, Bellamy was also quite similar to Luffy's ability in terms of speed and bounciness. The purpose of this trope is to have the protagonist, quote-unquote, fight and overcome himself, and thus give us an idea where he stands in terms of his power development. In Bellamy's case, we saw that Luffy was actually way stronger than him, which was in line with his up-and-coming rookie status before the Alabasta arc. Katakuri, however, shows us the exact opposite. While his powers are even more similar to Luffy's, his message at the beginning of the fight is clear. Whatever you can do with your devil fruit, I can do better. And so we learn very quickly that the underlying subtext of this battle is for Luffy to overcome himself and increase his fighting abilities. In other words, this was the very first battle where, in line with Rayleigh's explanation on Ruskaina, he will have to become stronger during a battle, compared to training beforehand as he did for instance against Lucci.
稽古はつけたが、覇気は実戦の極限状態にこそさらに開花す。
And what makes this battle against Katakuri so unique from Luffy's perspective is the incentive for it. You see, in almost every single major battle, Luffy's victory ends in the liberation of the people oppressed by the villain, as he's fighting for their sake in the first place. Luffy defeating Arlong, for instance, meant freeing Nami and her village from his oppression. Taking out Crocodile meant the end of the civil war and suffering in Alabasta, and when Luffy punched Doflamingo down into the ground, it literally cut the strings that were controlling Dressrosa. It's this pattern that usually makes his fights so satisfying to see. Against Katakuri, however, Luffy doesn't free Whole Cake Island or the Big Mom pirates from the Yonko's rage and tyranny. Beating Katakuri wouldn't change the country itself. And since Luffy has already retrieved Sanji and protected his crew by shutting himself together with Katakuri in the Mirror World, there was no one to liberate or rescue. And so suddenly, his battle and relationship with Katakuri moved to a much more personal level that was all about power and ideology. And for the very first time, he was able to fully focus on himself and his own ambitions. This is, I think, what makes Katakuri so different and unique in the story. So here we have the main objective for Luffy. However, moving down yet another layer, Luffy and Katakuri mirror each other not only on a physical level, but on a personal level as well. And this is where we get to the really interesting part of this video. As we slowly learn over the course of their fight, Katakuri's cool and composed demeanor starts to crack and slowly fall apart. Both him and Luffy have crazily similar personalities, only that Katakuri has built up this false persona over time in hope to protect his family. In his flashback, we see a happy and careless boy that is unapologetic about who he is. When Perospero tells him that his life would be much easier if he simply covered up his mouth, Katakuri answers that he doesn't care what others think about him, and that he would simply beat up anyone if necessary. The second trait we notice about him is his strong, protective nature when it comes to his family. This strongly reminds us of the Luffy that we know today, and so he only adopts his quote-unquote perfect persona once Brûlé gets attacked because of him. He lost his true self to the desire to protect his family. We actually saw a similar moment in Luffy's life after Ace's death, where he lost faith in himself. Luckily, however, he had Jinbei in that moment to set him straight. Unfortunately for Katakuri though, he didn't have someone like that within the ranks of his big but quite unloving family. Therefore, he adopted this new persona to protect his loved ones, and we can also see this discrepancy really well during the Merienda scene. While Luffy doesn't care looking weak in front of his friends, as we see in his encounter with Sanji early in this arc, nor about showing happiness and enjoyment, Katakuri literally puts walls around him to keep anyone from seeing his love for lying down and eating donuts. Luffy has to break down those literal walls for him to wake him up to the loneliness he's in. Despite being a well-respected member of the biggest family in the world, nobody understands him and knows who he really is at heart. And so, I believe what really sparked Katakuri's interest and initial anger when facing off against Luffy was the fact that he saw himself and his lost potential reflected in him. And so he had to prove to himself that he made the right decision in hiding his true self and covering up his face. Thus, at the beginning of the fight, the emphasis wasn't so much on "I'm stronger than you," but rather on "everything you do, I do better."
これでいいのか、エレファントか。
I believe that the excuse that Luffy will become a danger to Big Mom that needs to be eliminated right away was only part of his motivation. And so the fight became much more personal for Katakuri as well. As a result, we have a battle between two people who are incredibly involved with each other. One fighting to reach his potential in terms of power, and the other in terms of character. And I think that the resilience and will that Luffy demonstrates to ultimately beat Katakuri are also wonderfully reflected by the similar devil fruit powers as well. While Katakuri is mochi that when pounded stays pretty much as it is, Luffy, being rubber, always bounces back and can't be squashed.
何度立ち上がるつもりだ。
お前をぶっ倒すまでだ。
This fantastic thematic concept, combined with a compelling, multi-layered personality, is what gives Katakuri's character this intimate and likable feel that is quite unique in the story so far. Both Luffy and Katakuri make the other reflect on themselves and their respective weaknesses.
俺も同じだ。こんなにも攻撃を避けられることはない。
As a result, the battle is one of the best sequences of character crafting and character development at the same time, mixing great physical growth on Luffy's part with great psychological growth on Katakuri's. As their fight progresses, Katakuri gains more and more respect for Luffy. This is evident in the shift of language used, as Katakuri now is saying things like,
俺はもうお前を隠したとは思わねえ。どうした麦わら。
or
どうした麦わら。これでもう終わりか。
And so he slowly starts to admire Luffy's resilience and the rapid development of his future sight skills. It reaches a point where both are fighting at full strength, but both also seem to be really enjoying their duel. This becomes especially clear in the iconic scene where Katakuri stabs himself to make up for the wound he inflicted to Luffy after Flampe's interference. The fact that both of them take her and the other onlookers out of the picture with their Conqueror's Haki makes the relationship between the two even better in my opinion. At this point, Luffy has fully convinced Katakuri that being yourself and living authentically is important not only for your own happiness and growth, but also for that of the people around you. Better to be understood and accepted by few like Brûlé, rather than being admired for pretending to be someone else by someone like Flampe.
みっともない。まるでふくらうなぎ。
Thus, Katakuri throws off his scarf and starts embracing his true self once again. And so, while both fight at full strength, his motive has completely changed. At this point, Katakuri has a direct interest in Luffy actually winning this fight and proving to him that being yourself is the right way to go. In a way, Luffy defeating him would set him free from the facade that he's built for himself.
聞こえているんだろう。麦わら。
And so, while I believe that Luffy fairly beat Katakuri in terms of power and strength, he made it a point to fall on his back, showing Luffy his respect for his growth, while at the same time breaking the biggest aspect of his old fake persona. Now, his character has changed completely, from the cold and calculated villain to a compassionate and honorable antagonist that has now developed a true liking towards Luffy. And so, bringing all of this back to what we talked about earlier, what makes this fight so different is that Luffy is not liberating someone from the antagonist, but in this case, liberates the antagonist himself. All of this culminates in the heartwarming scene after the end of their fight, as Brûlé tends to her brother's wounds.
誰にも舐められない。完璧な男を演じてるんでしょ?
She knew perfectly well that Katakuri had fallen willingly on his back, and when Katakuri asks about Luffy, Brûlé guesses that he would be pleased to know that Luffy has successfully escaped Toddland. Katakuri smirks, confirming her assumption, and so, in the end, it was only Brûlé out of all people who was the only one to care the most for her brother's true self and suffering. And bringing this entire theme full circle, it was her that, with her mirror powers, enabled his and Luffy's change in the first place.
ここなら存分に戦える。
As a result, I think it's more than fair to argue that while Luffy won the overall battle, Katakuri went out of this fight as a true winner himself, having regained his sense of who he is and being pulled from his loneliness and isolation. It sets him up to become relevant once again in the story and makes him one of my favorite antagonists in all of One Piece.
随分未来を見てやがる。